to Take Home Pediatrics episode 4, Infants and Nutrition. I'm Dr. Bhumi, and before we begin, remember we are just an informational video and not a medical practice. So if you have any concerns about your child, please call your pediatrician. So originally I was going to be talking about tantrums, but in light of the news feeds on heavy metals in our baby foods, and of course my video last week on just general nutrition, and last year's new recommendations by USDA, I figured this is perfect timing to talk about our little ones and their nutrition. So the USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture, every 5 years puts out new dietary guidelines. And in 2020, it was a monumental year. They actually included specifics about infants and toddlers. And in addition, they actually included specifics about allergens in our food. So instead of just the general guidelines, which we discussed last time, the My Plate, which again, you can find that on myplate.com, I figured let's go ahead and focus on our infants. So the USDA and American Academy of Pediatrics are aligned in our recommendations for our infants. So for the first 4 to 6 months of life, recommendations are solely breast milk or fortified infant formula. Our breastfed babies should actually be getting supplementation of vitamin D, 400 international units a day. Our formulas are supplemented with vitamins, so there is no need for that. Now that your child is 4 to 6 months of age, how do you know they're developmentally ready to feed solid foods? So look for some developmental cues such as good head and neck control, sitting with support, grasping at items, especially grabbing your food from your plate, moving things towards their mouths like toys and teething toys and so forth, and then also starting to see that tongue thrust diminishing. So once that you know that they're developmentally ready, there are some rules about proper feeding. Number one, have a high chair, have them sit upright and belted in, and have that high chair up to the family table so that they can observe and even imitate how you guys are eating and seeing the variety of food. Number two, always have adult supervision throughout the whole meal time. Three, feed with a spoon or let them self-feed, but please do not put pureed or cereals into a bottle, and try to avoid those pouches. Both of those are developmentally hindering for our children to learn to chew and swallow. Number four, offer foods that are appropriate, developmentally appropriate in consistency and size, while you're still exposing them to variety of textures and flavors. Number five, start with healthy foods like we've talked about in the past. Healthy foods are basically those with only one or very few ingredients, not processed, and that includes all food groups. So some great first foods to start would be like soft avocados, steamed sweet potato or green beans or zucchini. We can look at pears, peaches, fish, eggs, oatmeal, or even multigrain cereal. So those are a good variety of food to introduce. Now, when we're introducing these complementary foods, please focus also on high iron and high zinc foods because our infants do need that requirement. And lastly, please avoid foods that have added sugars and added salt to it. So, next rules are about the food allergens. Like we said, now the new recommendations are to go ahead and introduce food allergens at 6 months of age while we're introducing all the other complementary foods. So what are food allergens? Those include eggs, shellfish, soy, cow's milk, peanuts, tree nuts, and all of those studies have shown that the early introduction before 1 year of age is decreasing our risk of those food allergies. So while we're introducing those, there are still a few things that we do want to avoid until 1 year of age, and that is raw honey, lunch meats, and fresh cheeses such as like goat cheese or feta cheese, and also cow's milk as a beverage we would like to avoid until 1 year of age. And lastly, while we're feeding our children, please embrace their mess. Don't let the fear of that mess hinder you from offering a variety of food. Go ahead and let them feed just with a diaper on, and make sure that you have a mat under the the table and under the chair so that the cleanup is much easier. Other foods that your child should avoid are chokeable items such as raw carrots, hot dogs that are cut into circular pieces, grapes, nuts, um, and popcorn. So, even chunks of peanut butter or nut butter can be hard to swallow. So if you're going to introduce that in that form, go ahead and mix it in pureed food or yogurt or even oatmeal before you go ahead and introduce that. So let's go ahead and now talk about different styles of feeding. So the traditional one is to introduce pureed foods one time a day and different varieties so that your child gets used to the different taste. However, recently in the last 4 or 5 years, a style called baby-led weaning has become very popular. I get lots of questions from our parents on that style, so let's touch upon that. So that style relies on the baby to self-feed from the beginning. And so that does have some advantages in that the child learns to manage different textures and flavors from the beginning. They use their fine motor skills such as pincer grasp and hand-eye coordination. They learn the feeling of hunger and fullness so they can self-regulate, and it has known to decrease picky eating in later childhood and adolescence. However, with these advantages, we do have to heed to the disadvantages. And those include, number one, our child may not be getting the appropriate nutrients because infants do need different levels of iron and zinc compared to adults and adult food. Number two, our child may not be getting enough food. Remember, we're relying on the pincer grasp to pick up the food and eat it. And if our 6-month-old does not have that, which most don't, they're not going to be able to eat a right amount of food. Number three, there's always a choking hazard. And number four, we do need to make sure of the added sugar and salt contents that are in adult foods, that we avoid those in our kids. So what do I usually recommend? I recommend go ahead and do a combination in that, yes, you can go ahead and start with the baby-led weaning, but as you're giving those soft pieces of food to your baby, follow up with pureed foods to make sure that they are getting enough caloric intake with each meal. So whatever type of food that you are going to introduce to your child, try to use a feeding style that relies on the cues from the baby. We call that responsive feeding, and really basically look for the hunger cues from your baby and look for the fullness cues from your baby. So what are some of the hunger cues? Typically they're getting excited when you're getting the food out, they're making some kind of noise that they're hungry, or they're actually trying to grab at the food that is at the table. So as you're feeding towards the end of the meal, go ahead and start looking for fullness cues. And what are those? Those are going to be, they're going to start pushing the food away from their tray, or they're going to turn their head when the food is approaching their mouth. They'll keep their mouth shut when the food gets close, or even use their hand to swat you away. So remember, this will help them self-regulate their feeding habits. And lastly, I do want to touch upon introduction of water. So remember, the first 6 months, breast milk and formula do provide all the nutrients and hydration that our baby needs. But as we're introducing complementary foods, we should be introducing some plain fluorinated water. We do like you to introduce it into a sippy cup so they start practicing using a cup. And we're talking about 1 or 2 ounces per meal, or about 4 to 8 ounces a day for that first year. Okay, now let's discuss the recent news feeds that we've been seeing about heavy metals and baby food. First of all, this is not a new discovery. Back in 2011, there were investigations about the arsenic in our juices and our rice. And in 2019, there was a new baby food council that was created in order to help with these regulations. Over the last 10 years, our heavy metal content in our foods have decreased about 50%. But however, since it's still detectable, and we do know the detrimental effects on development, on brain functioning, contributing to behavioral issues and attention issues, and even cancer risk, we as families definitely want to make sure that we decrease our risk as much as possible. Heavy metals that we see in our food are going to be cadmium, lead, mercury, and arsenic. And unfortunately, these have seeped into our water and our soil through agriculture, mining, and past use of pesticides. So our natural foods are still going to have a certain level of heavy metal. So while we await stricter rules and regulations, we as families need to do what we can at home as much as possible to decrease our risk. So let's go over some of those. Number one, have a variety of food. We've already discussed the variety of food is a good habit for getting vitamins and minerals, but now it's also going to stop our children from eating just one type of food, especially ones that might be at higher risk for the heavy metals. Two, go ahead and learn which foods have higher levels naturally. For example, root vegetables is going to have a higher level of heavy metals due to the fact that they're grown underground and they absorb a lot more of those metals through the soil. So those are like carrots and sweet potatoes. While we need those for a good nutrition, we do want to make sure that we change out our vegetables so we are not exposed to it constantly. Number three, wash your fruits and vegetables in cold water. Number four, change up your grains. As we know, the rice has the highest level of arsenic. So now we recommend oatmeal or multigrain cereals for our infants. Be aware of what other things might have rice in it, rice milk, brown rice syrup in foods. If we're looking at gluten-free foods, they have a lot of rice substitute. When we're looking at puffs or teething biscuits, most of those are also rice-based. So when we're looking at rice, the brown rice has the highest level of arsenic, while basmati rice has the lowest. So if we are going to have rice, pick the one that has the lowest levels, and go ahead and rinse out your rice before use, and also cook it with excess water, and then go ahead and drain it at the end. Other foods that we need to worry about are concerns of mercury in the fish. So make sure you are picking fish that have lower levels, such as salmon, cod, or light tuna. Protein powders, plant-based protein powders also have higher levels of heavy metal. Of course, we don't want our children to be having protein powder anyway, but just so that you know. And then, of course, we've discussed our juices have been worrisome about arsenic levels for a while. And again, we have also recommended no juice for our kids anyway. Another option you may think about is making your own baby foods. Remember, we may be decreasing some levels of heavy metal by avoiding the manufacturing and the packaging and possible additives, but we still cannot decrease the levels of heavy metal that are just naturally in the food. But while we're making our own baby food, we can, like we said, choose foods that are lower in the levels, such as using basmati rice or making sure we're cooking the rice properly. Also using a variety of vegetables so that we get a mix. Choosing organic over the non-organic, it does not make much of a difference. Unfortunately, our organic vegetables also still have the heavy metals through absorption through the soil, even though they do not use pesticide currently. The past use of pesticides are still there. So the levels have been pretty comparable between organic and non-organic. So while we're trying to decrease our levels in our food, be aware of other heavy metal exposures that we get through the environment, such as if you're in an old house, lead paint, lead piping. If you have well water, check the arsenic levels. Make sure that we're not smoking and vaping, as those are cadmium and lead exposures. So while we cannot get our heavy metal levels down to a zero, we do want to decrease our levels as much as possible. And while we families are working on that, we hope that the baby food companies will look for options of their food sources, and then also the FDA giving stricter and better guidelines. Thank you for listening, and I hope you join me next week for another pediatric topic.